Hello. Dr. Akobeko here, and today I'm going to talk about my travels to all of Japan's 47 prefectures. I've completed visiting all of these 47 prefectures by the summer of 2020, but it took a period of roughly 13 years to complete. Why 13 years, you ask? Because it takes a lot of time and money to accomplish this. For much of this journey, I was a poor student, so it took quite a bit of time to save enough money. To do this, I used three things. First is a JR Rail Pass when I was a visitor to Japan. This is a must, as you can ride any JR line train, including the Shinkansen or bullet train, as much as you want within a given time frame. It costs roughly $200 depending on the length, but considering that's the price of a one-way ticket, it's definitely worth it. For example, from Osaka, I took the first bullet train in the morning to have breakfast in Tokyo. Then I head off to Hakodate in Hokkaido before heading back to Sendai. That's at least $500 worth of rides right there. However, after I began living in Japan, this was no longer an option as the JR Rail Pass is only for people on a tourist visa. So I had to use the Seishun 18 Kippu, which means Youth 18 ticket, but it limits you to only JR's local lines and no bullet trains. However, both the JR Rail Pass and the Seishun 18 Kippu give you access to JR's lines all over the country from Kyushu to Hokkaido, and in some cases, the line of non-JR companies. There are also other rail tickets, like the Shikoku Free Pass, which I'll talk about later. So let me talk about Japan's geography first. Japan is divided into several regions. From north to south, it's Hokkaido, Tohoku, Kanto, Chubu, Kansai, Chugoku, Shikoku, Kyushu, and Okinawa. I started my journey in Tokyo as an exchange student in 2007. The first week was awesome, followed by several weeks of culture shock, and then a month or two of homesickness. Eventually I adapted and got used to life there. Using Tokyo as a base, I explored all the neighboring prefectures in the Kanto region, especially to Kanagawa. I'm a big fan of the anime called Slam Dunk, so I often went to the Shonan area every weekend because that's where Slam Dunk is set in. My first area outside of Kanto was the Kansai region. Yes, I was that typical foreign tourist that only thinks of Osaka and Tokyo when thinking of Japan. And that's exactly what I did. Visit Osaka, Kyoto, Nara, and Hyogo to see the sights. Years later, I would complete the Kansai region by visiting Wakayama for work for a few times and Shiga and Fukui. After my exchange in Tokyo, I moved to Okinawa where I worked as an intern. Okinawa is a very unique place in Japan that is Japanese yet not Japanese. While it's categorized as a region within Kyushu, I see it as a separate world. I'll talk more about Okinawa in a future video. I left Japan after that, but revisited every year as a tourist using the JR Rail Pass. This allowed me to reach so many areas very quickly. For example, I expanded to Hokkaido and then the Chubu region, where I enjoyed snowboarding and watching snow monkeys bathe in Nagano, while learning about Ainu culture in Hokkaido. A few years later, I returned to Japan to do my PhD in civil engineering, so I moved to Miyagi in the Tohoku region. During that time, I worked as a YouTuber for Sendai TV, making videos for their program called Go Go Tohoku. So through this job, I went to all the 6 prefectures in the Tohoku region. You might have seen my videos on YouTube before, but since Go Go Tohoku has disbanded, I'll be revisiting these videos in the near future. The next area I visited is Shikoku. I had some unused vacation time and decided to visit this island. I used the Shikoku Free Pass, which is available to anyone, even if you're a resident, and traveled to all 4 prefectures, as well as some of the smaller islands by ferry. And yes, I saw the Naruto Whirlpool as well, and yes, it is connected to that popular anime and manga that we all love, or hate. The last 2 regions were the hardest to explore due to their distance from eastern Japan. I've already visited parts of Chugoku using the JR Rail Pass, namely Hiroshima because of its many popular sites such as Miyajima and Okayama Prefecture. But to reach the remaining ones, I took an overnight train called the Sunrise Izumo. I'll make a detailed video of this journey in the future, but basically, I explored Izumo Taisha in Shimane and the sand dunes of Tottori, while doing random boring things in Yamaguchi. And finally, we had the Kyushu region. I'm currently doing a lot of fieldwork here to help promote disaster risk reduction. For that reason, I visited all the prefectures here several times. I really enjoyed the seaside views in Oita Miyazaki, and especially the food in Kagoshima, Fukuoka, and Kumamoto. Be sure to check out my video on Kumamoto ramen if you have the chance. After visiting several Japanese cities, you'll begin to notice that much of the country looks the same. Aside from some very unique areas such as Okinawa and Tokyo, any of the unique features of the city tend to be around the main train station. Usually the main train station has a large department store next to it, and an arcade nearby. And no, an arcade in Japan doesn't refer to a place for video games. That's called a game center here. It actually refers to a shopping street, which is the British meaning of the word. After that begins the sea of residential buildings. First dense ones, which gives way to more rural ones. The structures are more or less the same throughout the country. What's interesting is that people really follow trends here. Right now, the trend in high-rise residential buildings is black and white colors with wooden accents and glass balconies. I've seen this everywhere, from Hokkaido to Kyushu. In Japan, you can easily tell which decade the building was made because everyone follows the same design cues. The first thing people ask Dr. Akabeko is, "Hey, you've been to all 47 prefectures. Which is the best one?" And my response to that is that the first thing to keep in mind is that there are places that are nice to visit as a tourist, but not nice to live in as a resident. And you also have the vice versa too. For example, Okinawa is a great place to visit. I also made a lot of great friends there, and overall the people are much easier to communicate with. However, it's also a place where it's difficult to find a good job, whether you're a foreigner or Japanese. There's not that many good jobs there with good salaries, and it has one of the lowest salaries in the country. And it's also harder to travel to other parts of Japan due to its isolation. There's a reason why many young Okinawans end up moving elsewhere. On the opposite end, there are cities in Chiba and Saitama, where as a tourist, they're not the most exciting places. But as a resident, they can be pretty nice, with easy access to central Tokyo, but with much cheaper rent and more space. For example, I used to live along the Tsukuba Express line, and there were a ton of nice new places with rent that could be had for nearly half the price of a Tokyo apartment. And it's only 20 or 30 minute ride by train to downtown Tokyo if you need to go in. So here's my final recommendations based on my own personal travel experience. As a tourist, I really enjoyed Okinawa. I've made a lot of great friends there, like I mentioned, and I love a lot of the local culture and people. I also prefer the much warmer weather of Okinawa. But I doubt I can make a career there, as there's not that many opportunities. Interestingly, many retirees are trying to move to Okinawa. This reminds me quite a bit about the situation in Hawaii, where you have locals leaving, but outsiders moving in. Within the Chugoku region, I really enjoyed my time in Shimane and Tottori. It feels like a time capsule going back to the Showa period of Japan about 30 years ago. The reason for that is because the pace of life is slower there, and a lot of the buildings haven't been updated. Among Japan's 4 major islands, I enjoyed Kyushu the most. The food was the best, with much stronger flavors such as the use of more spices and garlic. I never really enjoyed food from the areas of Japan that faces the Sea of Japan. It tends to be too salty and bland for me. The scenery in Kyushu is awesome, with lots of variety in sea lions from the rugged coast to white sandy beaches. You also can have interesting theme parks, such as in Nagasaki. The area is well connected by rail, making it easy to travel around. However, for living, the thing is that most of the jobs are in the greater Tokyo area, and that's why people keep moving there and why it's really crowded. Personally, I have a love-hate relationship with Tokyo. Tokyo people are known to be colder and non-caring. It's crowded and competitive,
pushing your way in the trains and dragging yourself along to get to work, it gets really tiring and stressful. The lack of greenery and all the gray concrete can get to you, especially when you've lived in other prefectures in Japan. However, because of its high population, there's more internationalization here. That means there's all kinds of food options that you can't get anywhere else in Japan. For example, in addition to great Japanese food, I can find New York and Chicago style pizza sold in Tokyo, Peruvian food, Greek food, Turkish food, Argentinian food, Vietnamese food, and even Chinese food. You can get food from different regions, such as from its Muslim West, Southern Cantonese food, among many others. For this reason, I felt I enjoyed living in Chiba much more than Tokyo. Many parts of Chiba are still quite urban, but also a lot less crowded and easier to move about, making your day a lot less stressful. However, because it's next to Tokyo, I could easily go there for concerts, meet friends, try new foods, or other things on the weekend. However, that is assuming you live and work in Chiba. If you had to live in Chiba but work in Tokyo, that commute would be dense and long. Same for a similar commute from Kanagawa to Tokyo or Saitama to Tokyo. But living in Chiba, I felt I had the best of both worlds. Access to Tokyo, but a bit more space like in some of the rural cities. Nagoya is another area that's rising in population and economic growth. But between Tokyo and Nagoya, I'd rather stay in Tokyo. One area I've always wanted to try live in is Hyogo, especially in the Kobe area, or Shiga. Shiga is a very underrated prefecture. It has a beautiful lake in the middle, great views, and it's very close to Kyoto. It's no wonder that it's the only area in the Kansai region with significant population growth. Kobe, on the other hand, has a beautiful backdrop, being placed between the mountains and the sea. Tokyo is a very flat place, and sometimes I miss the mountains. Hokkaido is an area I'd love to visit as a tourist, but not somewhere I would live long term. Rent there is surprisingly cheap. You can get a relatively new place near Sapporo Station for a lot less money than in Tokyo. I tried there for a year, but to be honest, I wouldn't be able to handle the cold. And so, this is my brief summary of my travels throughout the 47 prefectures. Over time, I'll be making more detailed videos about each aspect mentioned earlier. So, subscribe to this channel for the latest updates. Thanks for watching!